deal. And I'll go ahead and I'll start just some reflections here, Nick, to lead you in, and we'll see where this takes us. Well, it says it now is 5:30. So, and this, you might riff off this a little bit. So Zach knows this. And, you know, the last 2 weeks have been really pretty eventful in my head. Of course, it's not uncommon to have a couple of eventful weeks in my head, because my head is a fairly eventful place. But a set of events have happened that intersected, that actually connected to my narrative. Joe and I had an exchange on the list. I narrated Proof Day a little bit to him, and that elevated some aspects of the I-Quad stuff that I had been done and made it more salient in a particular way. The salience of that set of ideas intersected with a podcast that I was mulling around in my head that Roger Penrose and Eric Weinstein had been having on theoretical physics. And they were talking about a thing called a Riemann sphere, which actually is a conceptual operator in my language that connects very much to my I-Quad insights. And I was playing around with that idea. And then I was, as I was saying, I see Joe's here, when I shared to Joe my my narrative and just felt resonance, because I think Joe is seeing or speaks or listens to me and speaks Garden, at least can comprehend Garden now. So that's good. Somebody can. And then I had an encounter. I just saw an article of it, actually is on some of what John Vervaeke does on the science of wisdom, and what wisdom is as a meta stance, step outside the stream as a participant observer, but also grounded in values, and then grounded in flexible value application across time, as being sort of that meta, grounded and moving in value as sort of the broad frames of what constitutes wisdom. So the intersection of these things actually collided in my head in a particular way. And the product was this thing that the intersection was wisdom energy. And the way in which wisdom and energy came together in my head was novel and exciting. And my cells did one of its things. And I got a little hypomanic. And I was metabolizing lots of different things. And I've been talking to a lot of people about the nature of wisdom energy. I was talking to John Vervaeke about it. And he was like, you know, that's Qi and Taoism. Oh, that's cool. Okay. And then if you Google it, you find a book, Wisdom Energy, The Path to Buddhism, 5 Easy Steps. Okay. If you actually think about philosophia, it's really loving wisdom and really loving wisdom energy. And actually for me, the reason that this is a real, I think, a segue into what you're going to be talking about is also it's very grounding in my body. It's also, although it certainly pulls my logos, it often is settling my heart. Okay? Into being into a particular way and positioning my being and becoming relation with a little bit more resonance. And I think, Nick, from what I've connected with you, certainly if I think about the connection that you offered in relationship to Rob Scott and what I feel when I connect to your wisdom, it is that core insight and the presence and the path that you have walked on in relation that connects to that. And so I'm really happy to have you here today and to share those thoughts and your wisdom energy with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're totally right. It's this insight, and it is that fundamental shift. And once you have it, it is, well, once you go there, there's no coming back, as they say. But yeah, so I'm super thrilled to be here. Definitely very anxious and excited to do this presentation with this group in particular, because I mean, talk about being around a bunch of smart asses. You guys are some of the smartest people I've ever met.
Right, we'll take that in both meanings of the term.
Non-duality, right? It's both and. So, but no, you guys are some of the greatest people I've ever met too. Kind-hearted, very intelligent. I'd call you all meta-wise. So I've really been looking for a group like this most of my life. So I couldn't pick a better place to share my perspective on things. And I know, Greg, you had asked me to share a bit about like my own journey with this. And I mean, I can do that. The way I have set up my presentation isn't so much that. I'll just say this to kind of preface me going into the presentation that, yeah, I've had a lot of ups and downs in my life, a lot of turbulence, a lot of struggles with certain mental illnesses, and just finding my way through this weird thing called reality. But it really piqued my interest. My struggles piqued my interest into a lot of like, what is reality? Why do we all see things differently? And you know, just exploring it more. And I've always been considered by others kind of a Zen guy or a yin yang guy. And I guess I've kind of looked at it from a similar way for most of my life. But then a few years ago, I had this shift. I discovered self-inquiry. I discovered Alan Watts. I discovered Muji. And oh my God, when it clicked for me, we will see as I struggle to get through this presentation, we will see how hard it is to describe what this shift actually is and what it represents for not only the fifth joint point, but really everything with humanity, where we've been, where we're going on the whole. It's truly it's something that's been sought after for centuries. This is the same discussion as spiritual enlightenment and awakening. And I'm going to try not to be too religious about it, but I'm going to make as many connections as I can. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and screen share. And as I was telling Greg, I've tried to do this many times, this presentation, and organize how I wanted to do it many times, and I have not found a good way. So I'm going to try, but part of me about halfway through is going to be like, damn, I should have just winged it, because that would have worked. But as long as I get the information across, that's all I'm really concerned with. It doesn't have to look pretty. So this is self-inquiry, non-duality, and what I call the identity crisis. So everybody can see the screen?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Cool. All right. When I is divested of I, only I remains. So that might not make much sense now, but hopefully by the end of this presentation, it will. I warned Lee about this, but I'm going to be taking a few shots at empiricism here. I'm not anti-empiricism, but it might come off a little bit that way. So brace yourselves if you are very hardcore naturalistic science. This might not sound fun for you.
Lee's got his bulletproof vest on. We're all right.
And again, the subject matter is essentially defined by its inability to be defined as the Tao. And I'm going to try to define it. So here we go. Well, we're going to learn a little bit about my metaphysics, which is well within the realms of non-duality. We're going to talk about what the identity crisis is and kind of how it gives rise to the meaning crisis. We're going to talk about self-inquiry, which is this non-dual practice. And I'm hoping we'll have time to make, I've got a few applications to whichever TOK acronym is the correct one now, as well as the problem of psychology. So some of my greatest influences, I'm not going to explain who each of them are, but if you are familiar with any of these individuals, then you'll probably have a decent understanding of where I'm coming from, because this might sound pretty alien to people at first. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of the metaphysics, then I'm going to get into what the identity crisis is, and then self-inquiry, and kind of tying it all together. And in my head, it sounds great. We'll see how it looks and sounds. So Advaita Vedanta is the non-dual mystical school of Hinduism. It is, Advaita literally means not two, non-dual. It's not one, not many. What we'll see is neti in practice. It is this principle of include and transcend, which we see in evolution of not just living things, but also inert things, where we see with entropy, they break down, but then they get more complex and they actually become something greater than what they were. So if you know integral theory, include and transcend is all over that. And it's both and. It's never either or, this or that. It's both and. So if you ask me, well, are you saying it's this or is it this? My answer is going to be yes. It's both. Nothing and everything. Vedanta, what that actually means is the highest learnings. It's supposedly this is why we call self-inquiry the direct path, because it's kind of this spiritual logical shortcut to enlightenment, to this awakening experience that helps you see through the illusion of identification that leads to suffering. That's about as religious as I'll get with it. So I don't mean this to be anything too literal. None of this is, for that matter. But just to give us some context about experience when I'm talking about these things, and I'm going to say these things, I'll be a broken record, so forgive me about that, but it's to help make sense of it all. Within our experience, we have mind, and mind is sort of the problem, or really identity is the problem. Identification is what causes the problem. But mind will include our sense perceptions, including their whatever interpretations we have of them, which kind of is what I think thinking is the mental interpretation or representation of a biological process. It includes memory, it includes imagination, thoughts, feelings, anything that you can put into a category, anything that you can label or judge or value or prescribe any quality to whatsoever is all activity of the mind. And here's my first knock to empiricism, is that it contains both the external and the internal world. It's all part of the mind. They're not different things. Then beyond the mind is the observing self. This is the page that the writing is on. This is the observer, the one who is aware of the writing on the page, the one who is aware of our thinking, of the mind. It is in acceptance and commitment therapy terms, which I'll be using kind of interchangeably. It's pure awareness, self as context versus self as content, the context in which the content arises. And beyond that is Brahman, or the void, depending on if you want to use Hindu or Buddhist terminology. And it's both of them. It's the ultimate underlying reality. It's the true ontology that really cannot be described. And all of this, realizing all of this and coming to some sort of an understanding of it experientially, is spiritual enlightenment, is awakening, is salvation. It's what most people have tried to pursue for, at least in religious traditions, for thousands and thousands of years. And I have to emphasize, it must be realized experientially. There's no way that you can understand it logically, but that's not the same thing. The shift, that fundamental shift, will only happen through the experience of some sort of understanding, some sort of insight, which for me came through self-inquiry. Now we're going to talk about non-duality in science. And The two have a very conflicted relationship. So there's a lot of scientific criticisms of non-duality, particularly around these sort of mythic romantic perspectives that, wow, physics, especially quantum mechanics, proves non-duality is the ontology. There was this book, I forget exactly when it came out, several decades ago, The Tao of Physics, which spoke to this, saying that by our empirical standards, by all this scientific rigor, we can say that metaphysics or quantum mechanics proves the metaphysics of non-duality, and that is absolutely not true. It could not be further from the truth, because if you really understand non-duality and if you really understand physics, then you'll know that we don't have anything close to the language. We're not at that stage in our evolution. We don't have the technology. We are not ready to say anything about anything even close to this yet. We can only kind of point to it. And that's what this presentation is just a bunch of me pointing to it and saying, this isn't it, but this is close. What we do have are some really interesting studies, really interesting research coming out within the last few decades about non-duality, more on the intra-personal level within the person. So we have non-dual states of consciousness, non-dual experiences, these peak experiences. Ken Wilber will talk of them quite frequently as the most powerful kind of experiences that you can have. And we have some corresponding evidence for where and how these things occur in the brain. I'm not a neuroscientist, and I'm not going to try to speak to any of that, but I've read some of the research. I did my thesis on a lot of this, so it's very interesting, and it's very nascent. It's very new, so we've got a long ways to go yet, but it's cool. And what I read most recently is there's some evidence for a corresponding personality trait right there on the big five, maybe make it the big six now, with this capacity to access non-dual awareness or unconditioned consciousness. I don't know how I feel about it being a trait, because I believe that it's already here for everybody. We just aren't all accessing it or being aware of it in the way that we can be. But I think that is just some really interesting research. I'm most interested, though, in using non-duality in clinical psychology, putting it into practice, and using some of those intellectual understandings as well as the experiential understandings that come with some of the meditative techniques that I use, such as self-inquiry or self-abidance, which are these more powerful meditations. And though a lot of this research is correlational, none of it's hard proof of anything. It's pretty auspicious, really, really promising stuff that has me hopeful for a more non-dual friendly future. And this is a reference here to that study about the personality trait. I can share that later if y'all are interested in it. It's got a very comprehensive breakdown of the research into non-duality. Now, I know I'm going kind of fast here, so if you guys have any questions, please do interrupt me. I do want to save some time for the end, but if you got something to say or some question to ask, don't be afraid to interrupt. And now we'll get into metaphysics with non-duality. So this is the best I can figure based on my understanding of these terms. And I don't claim to have any kind of an understanding like Gregg does. But from what I understand, the ontic is the question of what is there. The ontology then is the question of what is that on? What is it based? What is its essence? What is the root of it? And then epistemology is sort of how, and how do we know that? Like, how do we know what we know? And this to me is where I really have a struggle with third person empiricism, is how do we know what we know? And we'll get to that part. So then if we're putting those terms based on those definitions, at least into a non-dual framework, the ontic is the relative, it is form, it is the paper, it is the laptop, it is the table, it is the desk, it's anything that you can put those qualities to. It is mind itself. The ontology is space, the absolute. Now, ultimately, those two are the same thing. And I'm not sure how that works in a normal discussion with ontic and ontology, although I think there is a similar strain there where the two actually are the same thing, since the ontology is supposed to be the essence of the ontic. Although you can say that in non-duality, at least, that form and space are identical. So one isn't necessarily the essence of the other. They're the essence of each other. But for purposes of these terms, we can think of it that way. And then epistemology, we have the emic empiricism, which is the observer, the internal observer, which is also synonymous with the ontic and the ontology here. And when I say therefore, it's with my kind of objections to objectivity and third person empiricism, the second and third person intersubjective empiricism, which is the etic, the sort of outside experience of things, of reality, and how we know that. Now, this is my ontology, my beliefs about the essence of reality, and it is largely based within Advaitist culture, Advaitist beliefs, non-dual beliefs. There are some differences, but it starts with I am. If you talk to anybody who's into non-dualism, like into it and practices it and wholeheartedly believes in it, it's the thing they'll say is the one thing that I know, the one thing that I know for sure is that I am. This I am cogito ergo sum, tvatam asi, all the same thing. I am that I am. And all therefore is the self. Because if I am the only thing that there is, that includes everything else. And it's all the self. And it's all taking place on the self. Talk about language games. And then with this, there's what I call the polysemy of self. Polysemy is just that one thing can go by multiple definitions. So by that same token, self can go by any name, by many, many different names. And that's the Hindu conception of God and of reality, is that it's all this one energy that is playing the role of many different characters. And it's so good at playing these roles. It's such a great actor that it's taken itself into its own role and forgotten that it's just acting, that it's just a show, and it's taking it all for real. And we'll get to more of that as we go on. Nothingness, that space that sort of is the absolute, is not useless. A lot of people who understand non-duality will use that as a criticism, that well, what's the point of using non-duality, because what are we going to do with nothing? There's a lot to it. It's the basis for all somethingness. You can't have something without nothing. So we need to have a better understanding of what nothingness really is and be able to use that to I think see from a more wisdom oriented place when we're talking about the somethingness. And this is not panpsychism. A lot of critiques come again about panpsychism and its relationship to non-dual beliefs, especially Hindu beliefs. Panpsychism is the belief that everything, all matter, whether it's inert or not, has consciousness. That is absolutely not what I'm saying. In fact, I'm saying the opposite. We don't have consciousness. Consciousness has us. Human beings do not experience consciousness. Consciousness experiences being a human being. So fundamentally, I think we're asking the wrong question. This is really a sort of what Gregg talks about with the enlightenment gap. It's a very similar way of thinking, except more about reality than just that movement, the enlightenment. There is a reverence here for the integrity of reality. So we'll see again with nothingness, there's also that somethingness, which is the relative. And just because it's relative and just because it's ultimately then not real, doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. Everything matters. Absolutely everything matters just as much as it ever did before. In fact, it matters as much as it doesn't, if we're going to understand that in a non-dual way. This I don't exist except as an idea. That I is identity, the I entity. It is I, Nick. It is I, Greg. It is I, Lee. It is I, Mike. It is all these different I's. They are ideas, big ideas that we put a lot of investment into, and we're not totally aware of the implications. Self-inquiry addresses that. And the awareness that knows this I, the awareness that knows that I am, is different than that I that is an idea. So when I say I, it's going to mean different things depending on the context that I'm using it in. And that goes back to that quote at the beginning that when I is divested of I, only I remains. When I awareness am divested of I conditioning, identification, only awareness remains. And again, we have the self as context versus self as content. And in acceptance and commitment therapy, they do literally call that the observing self. It's almost straight up Hinduism, which is kind of weird to think about. It's the writing on the page, the weather in the sky. These are all the contents, the things that we identify with, the movie on the screen. Whereas the sky, the page, the screen, they are the context, they are the awareness. And a sort of epistemological principle that we're going to talk about a little bit too is that the self has to be fundamental to all aware things. Awareness has to be that fundamental aspect. If you're aware of it, it cannot be what you fundamentally are. The truth is already here. We don't need to go looking for it. We don't need to go investigating what is the truth. We can, and that's great. And if you want to do that, go right ahead, but we don't need to. So we can't really describe what it is. We've got a lot of sayings like don't mistake the map for the territory, or a description of the thing for the thing itself. You'll hear in Taoism or in Zen Buddhism a lot, the sound of a gong is not the sound of a gong. So my way of explaining that is the sound of a clap is different from. So when I say the sound of a clap, we all reference a clap, the noise, the actual thing. But that isn't the actual clap. There's the disconnect in the identification, is that we identify, that's the map. Me saying clap is the map. The territory, the reality is simple as that. So it's all right here. And it's our attempts to put it into these boxes and to describe it that actually make it more confusing. And then with, again, non-duality, essence of everything is nothing, nothing is everything. Brahman and the Atman are absolute, but you can't talk about, they're absolute and the relative, but you can't talk about these things, again, in a way that's going to tell you exactly what they are. St. Thomas Aquinas demonstrated this problem of language when he was asked about what time is. And he said, I know what it is, but when you ask me, I can't tell you, because if he were to put it into words, it would no longer be that thing. If he was to describe time in words, it's just words. It's not time anymore. All right. Epistemology, third person is inherently subjective, which would mean by third person empirical standards, it can't exist in the way that it purports itself to exist. This quote by Maharishi, by the way, these are all credited to Maharishi because he did not write. So people just wrote down what he was saying and then credited a bunch of things to him. You can't have the second or third person experience without the first person experience. It's all based in first person. You can have first person and not have second or third person, at least in the way that we conceptualize it. But you can't have third person if you don't have first person. In fact, even the notion of a first person experience arises in the first person experience. So it can't even properly define itself. And this is some of the issues I have with empiricism, is that it claims that we can't directly measure internal phenomenology. We can't measure what's going on inside our mind because we don't have access to them. but that you think there is an external objective world is a notion occurring within your internal subjective first-person experience. So while yes, on the relative level, on the dualistic side of reality, third person is there, and third person empiricism is fine and real and should absolutely be pursued. But on the non-dual level, it needs to be seen that ultimately it's somewhat, the word that comes to my mind is futile, but it's not futile in the sense that it's pointless. It's futile in the sense that it's never going to solve itself. I have some other issues with empiricism that we don't need to get into today. There's the acid argument is that you can't really argue with non-duality because on the non-dual level, nothing has any matter or nothing has any value. There's no justification for things because there's no need to justify. Reality doesn't need to be justified. So if you make any assertion, any claim that's based on a justification, that's based on a value, and according to non-dual perspectives, it fundamentally isn't true. It's not the truth with a capital T. But again, remember, I'm always going to be talking here on two levels, one that's non-dual and one that's dual, relative and absolute. They still matter on the relative level as much as they don't matter on the non-dual level. The only reason that they don't matter on the non-dual level is not because of their relativity, but because they are concepts and not a thing. So again, I'm not trying to knock empiricism. I'm just trying to show that it's not the sort of end all be all. It's not, I don't think it's the answer. I do believe in approaching it from a non-dual understanding though. I really strongly do. And I think that that's what we should be doing in the way that we should be trying to understand it and explore it. The whole point of this, that we are the absolute appearing as the relative, we cannot know the absolute in a relative way. And ironically, a better way of saying that is the only way that we can know the absolute is in a relative way, because we just keep pointing at it. But it's that same problem that St. Thomas Aquinas pointed out with language, that you just can't ultimately describe these things without creating something that isn't them to represent them. And that's just the way that our brains work. That's the way that we communicate. It's just the way things are. And that's the fundamental truth to it. It's, we have to accept that there is a dualistic side and it's not inherently bad, but we've got to be able to remind ourselves that these things, these descriptions, these representations are not the thing, because we seem to continuously forget that. But just because it's futile, just because it's not going to be the answer, doesn't mean that we don't do it. Doesn't mean that we put it down. Think about an actor in a movie. You don't tell an actor that his role in the movie is futile because the movie isn't real or because it's going to end. That doesn't make any sense. Of course, the actor's role is still relevant, and you still want them to play out that role. So we need to see it as not as a problem that we have dualism. And these boxes that we put things into empirically, these value justifications, this is the taxonomical problem that's inherent to empiricism. This is where modern empirical naturalistic science and postmodernism clash hard, because we have all these boxes and we're all saying this is the right box, no, this is the right box. And well, yes, they're all right. So now I want to talk about the identity crisis. To me, the identity crisis is what is us not being clear about who we are, about what we are in our most essential, simplest state of being. And I'm going to talk about this very, very broadly, identity here being ego. So we go back to like oral indigenous cultures. They didn't have ego and identity in any kind of the same way that we did. In fact, they weren't nearly as evolved as we were, so they couldn't. But they had an ego sort of as a tribe. They were one as a tribe. They were a small group. And eventually, we'll jump all the way up to Western civilization, comes into picture, takes Western religion, takes Christianity, takes Judaism, takes Islam, really all religions, but those probably most strongly, and it shifts the focus onto the individual, away from the group, and puts it on the individual as separate from, but also like subject to the church, makes us sort of this indentured servitude to the church, a slave of the church. And I don't mean this in an anti-religious way, more in an abuse of religion by Western civilization, because what it did is it took God, this idea of God, and it made that status and power. So all of your whole existence was determined by where you fell on this religious hierarchy, which was sort of BS in the way that it was applied. Because it was applied for selfish reasons. And you look at the Holy Roman Empire, and that's exactly what they did. They seized power of religion and used that to control the world at that time. Then we're going to jump all the way up to modernity. And with this, we have the Enlightenment. We have God is dead. Science comes along and says, we have proof God is dead. And science takes over for religion as the source of status and power. We have advances in game A, with everything becoming more and more efficient. It's all about optimization, make America great again. That's a good example of modernity to the extreme. And it damages the value of our traditions, and it damages the value of us as individuals, because it's all about what can you do for your country, not what can your country do for you. And I'm not saying that, again, that that's wrong, but it's to the extreme. And that's where we're seeing a lot of breakdown with our social institutions right now. Then we have post-modernity, which I think is a great thing that happened for the wrong reasons. So post-modernity came about and empowered the individual. It's all about you as a person and what you are, and putting yourself into these different boxes and saying, I am all this and that, and you need to respect every single part of this. Otherwise, you're not being PC and you're triggering me, and all this other stuff that's just too much, too far to the extreme. So I think post-modernity was the right thing in empowering individuals, but it was for the wrong reason, because it came about as a sort of rebellion to modernity. And that's not the way it should be done. It should come from a place of where we want to do this to empower us, not just because you've disempowered us, you being the system, modernity. But through all of this, what's happened is we've become increasingly identified with ego, with our identities. And with that, we come on to increasingly suffer some of these consequences. We don't really have a culture anymore. We've lost it. We're make America great again. Half of the country thinks America was never great. Some of us still think we are great. We don't have any sort of agreement on any of these things. We have no real relationship with God anymore, or with the universe, or with something larger than ourselves. We don't know how to talk to each other. We can say, oh yeah, I hear your opinion, I understand your point of view, but I don't believe it's true, and I'm not going to treat it like it's true, even for you. I'm just going to hear you and say that I hear you, but I'm not really listening. We have all these self-righteous indignations that are kind of blocking us, all these biases, and we're not even aware of most of them. These are a lot of those lenses that Rob was talking about in his talk about the fundamental shift. And I don't think anybody, at least in this group, would doubt that the system on the whole is corrupted. Some of us want to destroy it. Some just want to watch it burn. Some want to save it. Some just want to get out, and maybe even by ending their own existence, sadly enough. And some just want to, I think in this group, we're more on the, we want to improve it. But this corrupted system is going to continue to perpetuate our suffering. It's going to strengthen societal despair across the board. Realistically, until its entropy is done. And it is, make no mistake, it is in a very advanced stage of entropy. It is falling apart. So that's identification in the identity crisis on more of a large scale. Now we're talking about it on the level for the individual. And this is just more Hindu words or Sanskrit words for conditioning, operating classical conditioning. So we have samskaras, which are the impression of an experience on the mind, or the unconscious mind. They use memory to access sort of dormant samskaras, these kind of subliminal activators that produce a drive or a desire or an impulse to repeat or avoid a certain experience. And the more that you repeat certain experiences, the more reinforced an individual samskara or impression becomes. Fight or flight, basically that. Then you have vasanas. They are habitual patterns of behavior, including mental behaviors like ways of thinking, justification systems. And they're produced by heavily reinforced samskaras or groups of samskaras. Now, within the context of identification with the non-self, I want to stress it's still not bad. Inherently, it's not bad, good or bad. Those questions are dualistic questions. They don't apply. But identification in this way is where suffering comes in. So we have to understand it's just a process of learning, conditioning here. And it's necessary because we need it for a lot of socialized functioning. Think about like driving a car, all the stuff that you're doing when you're driving a car that you're not consciously doing. It becomes second nature, and it needs to be second nature. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to do it, and we wouldn't be able to function the way that we do. And this second nature of things, this conditioned things, becomes assumed to the point that we don't ever think about it. We don't even question it. And therein lies the true issue as we get to this. So yeah, I am Nick. I have a family, I have a culture, I have all these things here. But none of these things are me. None of them are me. They are all extensions of me. But they are so conditioned that I assume them to be me because I see through them. Here's those lenses that Rob was talking about. I see through them so clearly that I don't even know they're there anymore. I don't even think to look for them. And because of that, I am, without intending to, identifying myself as these things. And when I do that, I will suffer on their behalf. When realistically, in reality, when I trace back my experience, I am none of these things. And the suffering is in fact one of these things. It's just an experience that I am aware of. So the experience doesn't suffer. But when you think that you are the thing suffering, then you're not going to, well, you're clinging. That's what they call clinging in Buddhism. You're attached too strongly to it. And yeah, we see the language game on a more of an individual level. Here our meaning crisis at its source. We're discussing identity as if it's the essence of things when it's really the thing that has an essence. It's really the ontic. But we mistake that. And we've got to learn to question it. These, by the way, are all things that have certain prescribed values to them. And even values have values. Like Gregg uses the example of the neo-Nazi. Obviously, we think on the dualistic level that neo-Nazi is probably not a good thing to want to be. It's not really something to value. But on the non-dual level, there is no objective good or bad thing. There's no right or wrong thing to value. And ultimately, you need those bad people to know what the good people are. You need darkness to know light. You need pain to know pleasure. So it all serves a purpose and is all necessary in that way. So there's no inherent value. I've already kind of discussed some of these just common metaphors that I use. I don't think I did the King Lear one actually, so John Doe, this is about free will. On the non-dual level, there's no free will. So if I'm Nick, but let's say I'm John Doe now, and I go to sleep and I pretend I'm King, or I'm dreaming that I'm King Lear. King Lear might be having a great time, might be thinking that he has free will and all this stuff, but he doesn't, because King Lear is just a character occurring in John Doe's mind. And King Lear has absolutely no idea that he's John Doe. No idea whatsoever. So we, as awareness, are John Doe, believing that we are King Lear, ourselves the identity. And we, again, make all sorts of assumptions there, including ones like having free will. And that's not to say that everything is predetermined. I don't quite say that. I think it's everything is freely, spontaneously occurring, like a dream itself. So how do you know that you're not dreaming right now? You don't. And the waves in the ocean is a big one too. We talk about seeing waves in the ocean, waves being separate from the ocean. A wave is the ocean. They're the same thing. The ocean and the wave are not separate. The wave is not, I mean, it's not like a separate body of water. But if the wave comes up and says, oh yeah, I'm born, and when I go down, I'm going to die, then it's going to fear death. And it's going to believe that its end comes when it crashes. But it was never not the ocean. It just didn't know that. It didn't see that. It's the fish not seeing the water. And seeing that is seeing through the illusion of the identification with form, with the relative, is that's where the freedom comes in. And now we move on to self-inquiry, setting aside all the things that we're not, all the things that we can say are definitely not what I am at my core, the core of my being, tracing back my direct experience of this present moment, which, by the way, is the original empiricism. So the empiricism of your direct experience, trace it all back, take away all these things that are not there. I've already talked about it's deconstructive in that way, that it's taking apart all of these identifications that we have, taking apart all these layers, peeling them back. The point of this is to experience and cultivate non-dual awareness and unconditioned consciousness, which help us clarify who and what we are in relationship to reality. And I think to better live in, to live with, and to live for the dualistic and the relative world. Because if we have a clearer understanding about the non-dual reality, then we are much, much better prepared to handle ourselves in the dualistic relative reality. And that is one of the big points I wanted people to take away from this. The main question with self-inquiry is, who am I? That's what Ramana Maharshi would ask, is who am I? To whom does whatever occur? This deepens one's awareness, deepens your connection with awareness itself. It's peeling back all these layers, these lenses of conditioned identification. Here's the neti in practice. Not this, not that. Not my mind, not my body, not my emotions, not my thoughts, not the external world, not the internal world. Just keep on going. I am not this, I am not this, whatever arises in your experience. I know I'm not this because I am aware of it. There's the precedence of awareness. If you are aware of it, it cannot be what you are. And there's the illusion of thought too, with the, I feel angry. Whenever this is what I do with my clients, actually, is when you say you feel angry or I'm suffering, ask yourself, who's suffering? Find the I that says I'm suffering. You won't find it. It's a thought. It's not real. It's just an idea, but you have to look for it. That's the experiential part. You have to look for it. You have to see for yourself that it's not there in this weird abstract way. And that's where the experience and the shift occur. And when you do this, all that identification starts to fall away. The deconditioning process occurs, and you don't naturally automatically make these assumptions and identify with the phenomenal or the false identity, the false self. However, that doesn't mean that your phenomenological experience stops. It doesn't. It continues on, and a lot of those identifications will still be there. Just because I've had this sort of shift doesn't mean that I don't still identify with Nick. I absolutely do. And I should. If I didn't, I'd be a hermit and go off and live in the woods. But I see the relevance of Nick's role, and I, as awareness, want to play that out for whatever it is, and to have that trust that it's going to be the way that it should be, that reality should be. But we got to just be clear that these identifications are not what we fundamentally are. I have to remind myself sometimes when I'm struggling, oh wait, no, I'm not actually Nick. I'm just the awareness. I don't have to suffer this. And it's, the better you get at it, the more instantly freeing it is. or if it ever even troubles you anymore to begin with. Again, we have purposelessness being a criticism of non-duality and self-inquiry as well. You're really saying that we're nothing and none of what we do has a purpose. That's a really Western view of purposelessness, because in the East, they don't see it that way. You should want to be purposeless. You should want to have no meaning, because it means there's no inherent meaning. It's a freedom from any innate value system, which in Western society, especially in America, has put a lot of pressure on people that we don't need it. You have all this pressure to become someone, to have this identity and be outspoken. And if you don't, you're nobody and nothing and meaningless and blah. You might as well not exist. And that is absolutely not what self-inquiry, that is not what non-dualism want to say. But that is a Western perspective that gets way too quickly attached to criticisms of non-duality. So again, I want to approach that dual side from the non-dual side, approach purpose from the place of purposelessness, approach meaning from the place of meaninglessness. You go back to all those things that we identify and say that we are. All these things that we have to understand, that these things are not our meaning. We give these things meaning. We are the ones that give them meaning. And what that means is that we are the meaning. These things are nothing. They're empty categories, empty boxes. We fill them. We're the ones that call them boxes to begin with. And whether you know it or not, you're living in both worlds. You're already doing it. We're all already there. We all already have achieved this. We just don't quite realize it. We haven't turned in that direction with our awareness. It's kind of like quantum entanglement. That's the best way I can really describe it. But life is death and death is life. They're the same thing. A lot of this is I call it allowing the spontaneous flow of existence without putting oneself in it in a self-referential way. I call that living as if you don't exist. Going around as if you're just kind of these invisible eyeballs floating in space. It's a weird kind of way to imagine it, but if you do it, you feel lighter. It's not, you're not weighed down by the things that quote unquote matter. They don't have that weight to them because they're not, you know, that they're not that real. You don't have to take them that seriously. You still take them sincerely, just not that seriously. And a lot of this is just constantly reminding yourself who you are and what you're not, and refocusing yourself on the self, on your awareness itself. This is why, part of why I'm being a broken record in this presentation is to kind of drill it in so that you think about it. And I'm planting a seed. So why this is a solution to the identity crisis? Because we're all sort of losing our minds to illusory concepts. We've lost awareness of the present moment, lost awareness of the here and now, of ourselves in that same way. That everything that we do is colored with these biased lenses that we don't see through. And we see through them and we find ways to say, this is the answer based on the way that I see things. But we say like the answer, like it's capital, the only one, the capital T truth. And that's, who said it? Terrence McKenna quoted Ralph Waldo Emerson. If you think you are right, you are a majority of one. I think that's what that takeaway really is. Self-inquiry is a spiritual ophthalmology. I stole that one from Alan Watts. I love it. A spiritual ophthalmology. It clarifies, help us see clearly who we really are, so we can see and clarify our perspectives from their source and act from a wiser place, a place of presence, a place of being present in the moment, which is a more value-based moral place to be. that wants and seeks the betterment for all of mankind, all the things that we're trying to do here in Theory of Knowledge Society, despite it coming from a place of non-duality. In that non-dual place, you come to what's really good or should be good without saying it should be anything. All right, with the theory of knowledge, let's see. So there's a lot of talk about what we need to do to prepare ourselves for this fifth joint point, because it's kind of apocalyptic. It's especially we talk about it too much, we start to sound like a cult a little bit. The doomsday's coming. I've expressed this at least to Gregg, maybe to a few others here. I don't think we have to do anything. I don't think we need to prepare ourselves. I don't think that we need to make this thing happen, because we don't exist in that way. We don't have that potential to make something like this happen. We are the happening. We are that thing that is doing it. And regardless of anything that we do, we're going to get to that point, and whatever changes come are the ones that are going to come. We can't say what those changes will be. We don't know exactly what they are because they're on a whole other side of evolution. So if we knew what they were, we'd already be it. And that's what Alan Watts refers to as the quaking mess. The I that wants to be improved cannot be improved, because the I that wants to be improved is the I that needs improving. So by improving itself, it is trying to say that it's wiping itself out of existence. I'm talking about a double hermeneutic. It's a cyclical trap that we get ourselves in. I want to improve myself. I want to improve myself. Can't be done. Can't be done. Not at least without accepting yourself for where you're at and then approaching it in a different way. And you can think that you're improving yourself, but really it's just a sort of spontaneous flow of existence deciding that, hey, guess what? You get to improve. Because for many people, despite everything that they try to do, they don't improve. And as unfortunate as that is, that's part of non-duality as well. So we just have to let reality kind of happen and try to stay out of its way, or don't, because on the non-dual level, it's still going to happen. And I see justification systems as a more evolved layer of conditioning. I don't think, Gregg, you'd probably agree with that, generally speaking, because that's how we make sense of the world. That's our evolved way of making sense of the world. I don't think that they're so much of an answer for things, and I know Gregg doesn't really say that they are an answer, but these justifications are unnecessary. And I'll say this at the end too, I think that justification systems are part of the thing that we need to transcend at the fifth joint point, because reality does not need to be justified. Who are we to say what ought to be in this discussion of is and ought? Like, we don't know, especially from the non-dual level. We have no idea. We don't know how we know anything. So I think we can take it easy with all the, this is the definite direction of where we need to go. And there's my self-inquirer thought about this. Who is it that requires justification? Find the I that needs to be justified. You won't. It's not there. In relationship to the problem of psychology. So in many ways, I agree with Gregg about this, because yeah, it'd be great if we had a harmonized system, some common ground for psychology that we could talk about and base all of our theories on, and we just don't have it. But we don't know exactly what that would look like, and we don't know what that would exclude, especially if we're coming from more of a radical empirical perspective, which tends to exclude anything that doesn't fit into its own definition, because it has this sort of privilege. As empiricism has the position of privilege in science right now, because it is got all this rigorous research methods and evidence, and this is the only way that you could say that something is something, or correlated or causal or what have you. But it's not. It's we should be grounded in empiricism, but we should not be so quick to exclude the things that don't fit cleanly inside empiricism's boxes. That's, I guess, what I want to say with that. And again, it's the language games that are really the problem with it, is that we all say that this is what this is what change is, this is what changes, this is what changes from 4 different perspectives. And yeah, we're all right, but none of us have the same definition. We don't know what psychology is. We don't know what we are, who we are. And we're all trying to say that we do. Now, in that way, yeah, it is a problem. I go the opposite way, because from the perspective of non-dual psychology, which is actually becoming its own separate sort of division of psychology, they're all right. We're all pointing to the same elephant and just saying that it's different things. And that's the polysemy of self. We're all saying the same thing, but by many different names. Now, I think we could do a better job of equalizing that a little bit to each other. And yeah, again, it'd be nice to have a common ground. Who determines what that common ground should be? I don't want to even try to answer that question, because it ain't me. I really like this quote, which is kind of ironic considering that that's the author of the book, The Tao of Physics. Science does not need mysticism, and mysticism does not need science, but man needs both. I mean, that's non-duality at its finest right there. And that's kind of my concern with empiricism, is that it doesn't have to have a spiritual ontology, but it can't exclude spirituality. It just can't, just because we don't understand it enough to say that we can explain it on the same level that we can explain certain biological processes. It's not about virtues or values, because virtues or values have to be justified. And if they have to be justified, by definition, they're relative. We have to be willing to bring ourselves to the core of our own existence. We have to see through not just our conditioning, but the process of conditioning itself, as the self, as awareness, and to see the world as it is, and let it evolve naturally without resistance. And I myself, I think it's just as unreal as any of these other mental or physical systems that we can define and describe. But I think I myself is the biggest and most central justification that we make. And again, I think that these justification systems, our identities, are the thing that need to be included and transcended at the fifth joint point. All justification systems. Doesn't mean we need to abandon them. We just need to see them for what they are. And not just the ones that we don't like because we say that they don't deserve to be justified. At their essence, they're the same thing, a justification. So if we're really going to understand and address a lot of these issues facing our society and our world right now, or even our personal lives, tending to our own gardens, we got to clarify really who and what we are. We got to see ourselves for where we're at. I don't think we've done that yet. I think that self-inquiry and its surrounding non-dual metaphysics give us a sort of practice to do that from the bottom up, as opposed to going from the top down. And I'm a big proponent of the bottom up way of doing this. We're not going to try and say we know everything without having all of the underlying things, or most of them at least, explained first. And if we really want to embody an understanding of reality and ourselves, we got to get around this 2 levels. On one level, we are reality. On another level, we are just its content. So we need to be aware of that and accept this no free will thing, so that we can just spontaneously exist, which, at least in my experience and the experience of the people that I've worked with and practiced with, that it leads to it leads to all of the things that are actually still dualistic assertions for betterment of mankind, for righteousness, which is the direction that we are trending in terms of evolution. Rob talked about the isness a lot. There is no better, there is no ought. There only is. Things are. Am is. I am is. There is only this isness that we call many different things. And we can try to say there's an ought, but we don't know until it is. If it ought to be, it will be. If it ought to be, it probably already is. So buckle up, enjoy the ride, respect your fundamental oneness with everything and nothingness, and be the best expression of that you can be. Play your role to its fullest. Everybody go out there and win all sorts of awards for being best actors or whatever it is in your field. And that is, yeah, I don't know. Are we still here? Were we ever here?
Well,
We made it.
We is here for the time being, whatever slice of time that is. So thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Well, we can. That brings the presentation. Let's see where it takes us. Certainly raised a number of sort of very interesting thoughts that I could riff off of a little bit. Let's go to the audience first and see where folks are and what questions they may have.
What makes a unique expression the best one? Nothing inherently does. I think that's something that you feel. If you feel like I practice acceptance and commitment therapy a lot with my clients, and it's all about following a value system. So if you clearly identify what you value in life, regardless of whether, forget the non-dual level for a sec. If you're clear about what you value in life and you live your life in accordance with those values, you'll find yourself in a position where you feel good about yourself. Your life is fulfilling, it is meaningful. And I think that's the way that you tell that you're doing at least a good job of being your unique expression of yourself. Because in my experience, if you are not living in accordance with your values, then you start to suffer because you're not doing what you feel is naturally what your relative existence has a sort of natural proclivity to, a natural tendency towards. I don't know if that answers your question, Corinne.
Other reflections or?
So, Nick, thanks for the talk. I placed a peace offering in the chats there.
Yeah.
In my life, I've written one and only one poem, and it's called I Am. I simply am. I am my thought, I think, but I am my thought, not my thought. So it resonates with a lot of the non-self things that you said. But could you just read me the last bullet on the next to the last slide?
I posit here that justification systems, our identities, are the thing to be included and transcended at the fifth joint point, as well as all other justification systems.
No. The last slide that's full, that has the bullets, the last slide.
With the conclusions?
Yeah.
Oh, the very last.
Yeah.
The buckle up, enjoy the ride one?
Yeah, what's that say?
Buckle up, enjoy the ride, and respect your fundamental oneness by being the best unique expression of it that you can be.
Are you saying that is what we ought to do?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, not if you don't want to.
But the bullet before that says there is no ought, and then you tell us what we ought to do.
Hey, two different levels though, right? Two different levels. I mean that in the sense that, yes, on the relative level, yes, let's be the best that we can be. On the non-dual level, we need to understand that there's no pressure to be the best that you can be. Because it's not really, on the non-dual level, there's no choice in the matter. You're going to do what you're going to do. You're going to be who you're going to be. And it's just kind of the way that things work. Otherwise, if we wanted to change ourselves, if we wanted to be different than what we are, we'd do it. It wouldn't be such a challenge if it was really such a choice for us. I guess that's really where I come from with that. Yeah.
Nick, in terms of you talked, there were a number of things that I could go, but since you brought that up, I was going to go a different direction. Let me twist. Talk to me about, I mean, dual, non-dual. Okay. For me, I definitely, I talk about, okay, what are the various language systems? What are the frames that we are in? I like the Wilbur quadrant frame a bunch. I like, so for me, as I hear this, okay, my frame on this is as follows. I drop into upper left, all right, and the observing self, and the essence of observation and seeing as being, okay,
Yep.
where all else then dissipates, and the observer becomes the observed in a feedback loop of a pure, which people who meditate experience as a pure consciousness event. Okay, but I'm not an advanced meditator, but I can feel, and I believe I've experienced in particular kinds of modes of being, a full drop into oneness in that regard.
Sure.
Okay. So, and that is so for me then, that is an epistemology that then frames a particular non-dualism that gives rise to all sorts of different powerful sets of insights that a number of wisdom traditions have delineated for us. Okay, so that's the way I hear that, and I hear that in relation. And then there's dual, okay, which I would interpret a number of different ways, but we can then talk about scientific dualism. Scientific dualism splits the scientist out from what I would then call the ontic reality that it projects out there, and then begins the process of, here, I'm a knower, I have to build maps of this territory and create empirical methods in relation. And in that justification of objectivity, and I think your point about, it's a great question about, well, what do we mean by objective? How much of it is a shared intersubjective social construction and relationship? But then again, it's a lot different than deciding manners when we build the periodic table. So there's something there, right, in relationship to that. But now we're in the dual world, which is really important. And the objectivity game is in that grounds then offers a particular kind of justification for what is true. And so I guess what I'm hearing is I try to sync up with your language system, the dual versus non-dual, absolute versus relative, the frames of reference, both are important, but the world can look quite differently when we jump from one frame of reference to another. It's actually helpful to have both absolute relative, dual, non-dual ways of being.
Yeah.
So let me see as you hear that, how does that sit with where you are?
No, I think that's really exactly what I was trying to get across. And really, yeah, it's a huge shift, just switching back and forth in conversation between those two levels. If we're talking about I from non-dual or I from dual, it's very, very polar opposites, right? I mean, they are diametrically opposed. But we need them to be that way, because if they weren't diametrically opposed, if it was just one thing, we would have no sort of base of comparison, we wouldn't even know that we existed. If self needs other to know self, I am only I. If I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am I, then I am not I and you are not you. So we need to be able to know that from the non-dual level, that we give each other that meaning. But then on the dual level, we still have the ability to then separate it out and sort of, the way I see it, to sort of play around with this reality, have fun with it. But fun looks very different to different people, right? For me, fun might be going to play basketball. Whereas for some people, fun might be dissecting a frog. They're equally fine. There's no problem with that. My emphasis is really just on the at least when we're talking about epistemology, that it all arises in a first person up in the upper left. That if you didn't have the upper left, you could not know the other squares. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. I would completely agree that the observing self, pre-person observing self, that I believe emerges in the animal kingdom. Now, I know that based on scientific ontology that helps me explain that. Okay. Right. And I need a justification system that maps all that. But the observing self emerges at a particular state of the mental. In fact, this is what John Vervaeke and I are all, we're really deconstructing from a dual known type of perspective, but also doing with, and this is what I think empiricism or old men's knowledge and hopefully wisdom oriented men's knowledge will be able to weave this together and appreciate this a lot better, is that they eliminated a lot of this, meaning that there's an enormous amount of wisdom and many wisdom traditions that are embedded in this. But I see that Joe's got his, I think, Joe, you have your hand up. Maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I was putting my hand up earlier, Nick, to the basketball thing. So I'd definitely like to go play hoops.
Yeah.
But I have I have very little intelligent. I have nothing of intelligence really to say about this. So, but I have a question, and that is this. I mean, I have studied Buddhism to some degree. So is this, Nick, essentially Buddhist psychology then, if I could describe it that way? Or is there, are there other elements that you're weaving in or have woven in that I've somehow missed?
In terms of self-inquiry, when we're talking about seeing through the illusion of suffering, absolutely, this is Buddhist psychology, yes. And that's why, you go to East Asia, they don't really have counseling in clinical psychology the way that we do in the West, because they go to temple, they go to they're monks, they get these spiritual insights, and it's I don't know if it has more to do with their collectivist culture or just that extra couple thousand years of traditions. But
It's funny you say that, because my next question to that was, why would I go talk to you, Nick? And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean, I was literally following from your philosophy and what you described. I was trying to think of how I would put principles into practice, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. No, and as a clinician, I don't always tell my clients this up front because I got to make some money, but it's my goal to teach them to, one, be their own therapist, but really that they don't need me. To show that a lot of what I do is showing people to accept themselves for who they are. And when they do that, then they're able to become the person that they say they wanted to be. It's that resistance that kind of perpetuates the struggle. So yeah, no, don't come see me. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to work on yourself. From the non-dual perspective, it's all taken care of for you.
Well, this is great. I mean, I have a long way to go in all of this, but so this leads to my last question. And I don't mean to sound like a nihilist, but I then find myself honestly wondering why even bothering.
Yeah, that's kind of where the mind goes when you get into non-duality is, well, what now? What's the point?
Yeah.
And I think after a while, at least for me, and for actually a lot of people that I know, it took a little while for a lot of these insights to settle. It's like somebody drops a giant boulder in a lake and it just disrupts everything, and then it all settles back in. But that rock, that boulder is still there in the lake, whereas it wasn't before. So when it all settles and you see that if nothing, let me try to put this in a more experiential way. One of the analogies that Alan Watts would use to describe this sort of purposelessness is yeah, when you're a kid and you just go on a walk for no reason, and you're just going through the woods and you're hitting trees and stumps with a stick, and you're literally just doing shit. And it's great. Like when we think back about it, it's some of our fondest memories, right? Because everything's just free. There's no have to. There's no ought to. And in that way, there's no pressure. And it doesn't mean that you don't do anything, because guess what? You're still a human being. Even with non-dual understandings and insights and that big fundamental shift, you're still a human being, and you're still going to have desires. You're still going to have wants. You're still going to have struggles. You're still going to suffer. It doesn't exclude you from any of that. It just gives you a different perspective from which to view that. And I think it's a much wiser perspective.
Let me offer one final thought then on my behalf, and then I'll shut up, because again, I don't have much to say. But what I think I take away from your talk too is that I have had a lifelong insatiable pursuit of knowledge, and that goes to two PhDs. And Gregg knows about my work in landscaping and music. I've tried to do everything and learn everything, and it has led to infinite suffering, is the way I would put it. Yeah. So in other words, my insatiable pursuit of everything has led to me going insane and becoming incredibly depressed and suffering greatly because I can't know. I'll just end there.
Yeah, because the more you know that you don't know, and the more it's the getting lost in Wikipedia. You go to look up one thing, and before you know it, you've clicked on like 6 or 7 different other Wikipedia pages, and you're down that rabbit hole. This is me trying to keep up with Gregg. I can't do it. Every time I watch one podcast, I'm like, I gotta watch 3 others to even know what he's talking about here. And it creates a lot of frustration. And it's good to have that knowledge for sure. But there's that part of me that just knows, like, man, there's not an end to this. It's just gonna keep going. So I gotta kind of pick and choose more. If this is, clearly for Gregg, that's what Gregg does. So that's what he's gonna do, and he gets an enormous amount of pleasure, I'm assuming, from that. It's not the same thing for everybody. And yeah, I know sometimes in the head it's just like, come on, dude, just shut up. But good. Yeah.
Can I make a comment? Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So Nicholas, thank you for the talk. The Eastern traditions, in my view, have such richness to them that we can learn from in the West. The whole idea of a process, kind of a mentality, the holism of it, the non-reductionism of it, the emphasis on experience, where we try to explain all that stuff away. There's so much richness, I think, in so much of the Eastern ways of thinking. But there's a however. I don't see this so much as an ontology as I do as an epistemology. It's one way of thinking about the world. It's one way of thinking about the world. And I could see its value in clinical circles because it has such great, here's going to be a left-handed compliment. It has such great malleability. As a justification system, you can justify anything. It's Freudian post hocness, to the nth degree. It's so amorphous that, it can absorb everything. And if it absorbs everything, it absorbs nothing. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, we've got this tremendous richness. On the other hand, we have, the waters that you slip in, what do we do with it? Where do we go with it? Now we're talking about nihilism and all of that stuff, just there's many examples I can give, but I'll just give one. It's already been given. Should we not have voted for Trump, or should we not have voted for Biden rather? Should we have not fought Hitler? Are we really prepared to say that the world is the way it ought to be, or that there are no oughts? It's one thing to say that oughts are human constructions, that oughts are created in the realm of human experience. It's another thing to say they don't exist. We act on the basis of when you end and say, go do your good work. Good is an ought, good is an ideal, good is a value system, and these matter. These value systems matter. And that's one example. So I ask you, ought we not have fought Hitler? Or did it not matter? And what does that have to say about Buddhist traditions? And I say this fully aware that there are more Buddhists and Hindus and Chinese traditionalists in the world than there are Christians. Okay.
So my short answer is yes.
You see, that's what happens.
But so, okay, let me try to break this down. I missed something that I was going to say, but with the whole, this is that 2 levels of discussion again. It's hard to, unless you're like, you spend almost your whole world in non-duality like I do, it's hard to shift back and forth in conversation like this very easily. So on the non-dual level, there is no free will. There's no choice. We didn't choose to do any of that. It was only on the relative level that we thought we even had the choice, let alone made the choice to do any of these things. So, and this is what I had to, this is one of the most powerful experiential insights that I had. We talk about free will. One of the examples I see is, well, can you move your arm? Yeah, of course I can move my arm. Look at that. How did I do that? I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea. My brain knows how I did it. My brain's the one that did it. I didn't do it. The way I see it on the relative level is it happened and my mind took credit for it and justified it. So from the non-dual level, all of that just happened that way. It's not random. There's an order to the chaos.
There is a really fundamental difference between voluntary motor control and involuntary motor control. Right?
Yes. Oh, for sure there is. But I would say that all of that is on the dualistic level. On the non-dual level, with no free will, everything is just spontaneously happening by whatever dualistic process you want to call it.
But there are better dualistic descriptions than others.
Sure.
Okay.
Right.
So if we want the best dualistic process to describe, that's what I'm pursuing.
And that's from the non-dual perspective, that's your role.
Right. Okay.
And you're doing it to it.
Right. And then when you say it's my role, I don't even know that, well, what is it, an ontology that says that, or just if is isness, then you simply just commit to what is. To then say it's my role would then suggest that there's a teleology to isness. So,
or I, or an I.
Or some sort of consciousness that is awakening with some sort of energy or direction, or other than just the base of isness is whatever is.
And it is that isness, because it just is. How are you going to argue that, right?
Right.
And yeah, there is a directionality to it. But in the same way that a dream has a directionality, or a movie or a play has a directionality to it, our roles have that kind of directionality, but it's not a predetermined directionality. It doesn't mean that you're going to get anywhere. It's just the way that awareness is unfolding for you, if that makes sense. It's not something you chose. It's not something you choose on the non-dual level. It's not something you chose. It's not something that you choose. It's just what your organism does. And yeah, this is kind of,
aren't they the same thing? That to say that what my organism does, couldn't that be
yes,
what we mean by I choose?
Yeah,
what
well,
my organism does, because the word does means active, right? In the same way that we use the word does when we attribute our agency to our mind or to ourself, right? I mean, so the doing, the active organismic doing of the organism, of which consciousness plays some role, might be what we mean when we speak of I.
Sure. Well, so you kind of to that point, yeah, there is choice. There is, talk about behavioral investment theory. We have this nervous system that has invested in certain processes that to help maintain our survival as a species and propagate that. So, yeah, and to say that there's no choice in that there's no selection in that, obviously there is. It's who made that selection happen. That's really, to me, what the question here is. And it's not I, Nick. It's not I, Gregg. It is something else more fundamental to our existence.
That might be a point I'd be interested in. For that. I think Steve's gonna. Steve, can tell whether you're gonna jump in there?
Well, there's a lot going on, and my thinking is spinning, and I didn't want to jump in off topic, but I do want to say that your presentation reminded me of somebody, and I was trying throughout to figure out who it reminded me of. And then this is a name that wouldn't be familiar, I think, to anyone in this group, but there was a philosophy professor at San Jose State University who made a name for himself in the 1970s in the California vicinity, advocating something he called clinical philosophy. He thought that folks with certain conditions, it wouldn't apply to across the board, would benefit more from spending time talking to a philosopher than talking to a clinical psychologist and working with. And so he was a friend of my family's, which is how I know about him back in I was a little kid in the 70s, but I do remember his presentations because my dad would take me to see them. And I just remember being enthralled by that. And I've always remembered this. And so I'm thinking about working with a counselor who perhaps has philosophical ideas that are at odds with mine. I disagree with you about the is-ought issue. I actually don't think that there is an ought, but there should be, and that changes everything. So there ought to be an ought. But notice, that's at odds with you, but we're playing a different kind of game talking through these issues, that the conversation as it's been unfolding, than we would be if you were committed to empirically supported treatments. And that's how you went about your work. So I would much rather go to a counselor of your ilk, even if we were completely at odds on the plane of ontology, but we can work through those issues and kind of think through them, versus a simple dogmatic empiricist who's going to employ the latest techniques that have been established in research to help me deal with my whatever depression. So that's kind of how I've been thinking through what you've been sharing with us. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes perfect sense. And I can't tell you how many times that my clients have reiterated some variety of that point. Never the word philosopher, but I mean, it's 100% true. I put more stock in my clinical skills as they come from my philosophy than as they do from my clinical training. The clinical training is all about, mostly about things that are kind of like human qualities, like your capacity to show empathy and put yourself in another person's shoes. And then, yeah, there's memorizing all these manualized treatments, which is another problem, a shorthanded problem of empiricism. It's the right direction for empiricism, but we are far from perfecting manualized treatment, obviously.
But yeah. By the way, just to cite the reference, Peter Kestenbaum is the fellow's name. He's still alive. He's retired. But one of his famous texts was a new image of the person, or the new image of the person. I forget the article. But new image of the person was his sort of manifesto for clinical philosophy, and that's how I've kind of been thinking through the issues you've been raising, and some of the points you made sound very similar to arguments that he had made.
Well, he probably listened to a lot of Alan Watts then.
I'm sure. It was that. I mean, it was that period.
Yeah, it was. I'm gonna look into that though. That's very cool. It's very, very cool.
Any final thoughts? I know folks are sending here that they're getting ready to run. It's 7 o'clock, and it's been a stimulating exchange. So
let me just offer one thing. Nick, thanks a lot. As you pointed out in the forward, you and I come at this from very different angles.
Mhm.
If you think it would be useful or helpful or even fun, I would be very happy to engage you with a one-on-one in this. We're going to go through the slides one line at a time.
Boy,
And if I don't understand it, I'm going to ask. And if I don't believe it, I'm going to tell you why. And if you think I'm full of shit, you're going to tell me that. But I really think that that's an opportunity if you want to do it. And if you have the time for it, you're a busy guy, you got early and everything else. But I would be happy to do that line by line to see if there's an insight that comes to either of us.
you know, Ali, let's correspond after this.
All right.
I would love to do that. I think
Okay.
there's only growth that comes from that.
Yeah. Good.
Love to hear that. Love to hear the connections in the whole TOK Society
Just
growing.
the two of us.
Right. Nick, thank you so much
Thanks
for sharing. Certainly, I think that one of the things that trying to jam psychology into the modern empirical natural science frame did was it pulled us away from our grounding in the subjective observer of beingness. And that's pretty ironic given what the East discovered about the importance of that centrality for thousands of years in dealing with suffering before we decided to start coming around measuring shit from a third person perspective, if that's even possible. So thank you for reminding of us of that. And I have a deep appreciation for the wisdom you shared with us today. And I really appreciate you taking the time. And it obviously was engaging to the audience. So thank you so much.
Thank you all. I really, really enjoyed doing
Thank
this.
you.
This was great for me.
All righty. All righty, folks. Thank you. We'll be in touch. Rock on. I'll put this up unless there are any objections on Wednesday. Take care.